Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Rousso. I'm the Artistic Director of the Mallarmé Chamber Players, based in Durham, North Carolina. The Mallarmé Board and I are thrilled to announce our 2020-21 concert season, which brings small chamber music ensembles into local concert venues with a variety of configurations and repertoire, which is exactly what Mallarmé has been doing for the past 36 years. But this year we'll be doing things a little bit differently. Musicians will rehearse and perform together, but they will be distanced and masked. We will then record these hour-long concerts in 4K with high-quality sound to be presented virtually and safely to you in your living rooms, mostly on demand. More information about upcoming events can, of course, be found on our website, mallarmemusic.org, or on our Facebook page. Additionally, we will be presenting other online content, including an interview platform we're calling Mallarmé's Music Among Friends series, where we speak with Mallarmé artists and find out what they are passionate about musically and hear them perform solo music of their choosing. This is a way for you to get to know our musicians personally from their homes in a way that you would never have had the opportunity to do during the course of a regular live concert season. So we are looking forward to getting back to live concerts when we can, but in the meantime, I hope you will join us on your near smartphone, computer, or television. For the first of this series, I would like to welcome Nicholas DiEugenio, who's the Associate Professor of Violin at UNC-Chapel Hill and the co-director of MICO with his wife, pianist Mimi Solomon. Hey, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Suzanne.
Oh, I'm thrilled to have you as our first participant in our Music Among Friends series. So I was looking at your website, Nick, and it says that seeking to traverse stereotypical boundaries between the modern and Baroque sensibilities, you perform on various instruments in various states of hysterical undress. Thought that was interesting. Always searching, not so much for how music may have sounded, but more for what music may have meant at its birth and for what it might mean right now. Could you tell us a little bit about your pandemic Bach project and specifically kind of referencing your quote on your website about historical performance practices?
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you liked that quote, or that you were interested enough in that quote to bring it up into this interview. And actually, I know this is hard on Zoom, but specifically for this interview, I had to get, speaking of dress and undress, I had to get dressed up into my my fugue shirt. So maybe I have to stand up and show you. Wait.
Oh, okay.
Can
Yeah,
you
sure.
read it? Okay. So may the fugue be. This is my Bach "May the Fugue Be With You" T-shirt that I've been wearing.
I like that.
I'm really nerding out in the pandemic.
Hey, if you can't nerd out now, when can you nerd out?
So I guess just to answer your question about the project specifically, when this whole thing started back in March, I was actually in the process of preparing for a concert that I was going to present over at UNC, actually in conjunction with my colleague there, Lee Weissert, who's a great composer and electronic musician and improviser. And we actually had created a scenario in which I would play two of the solo Bach pieces. So I was going to start with the G minor sonata, and then Lee and I were planning to improvise from the end of the G minor sonata, kind of using some electronic sampling of what I played in the G minor sonata, improvising with that together, going into a piece by Arvo Pärt called Mirror Within a Mirror, and then improvising out of that back into the Bach C major sonata. So it was going to be kind of like a total concept program with some improvisation, bookending the Pärt in the middle with the two Bach pieces on either side. And so I was getting really excited about that and was playing a lot of Bach just in preparing for that. It was supposed to happen at the end of March, and so a few weeks before everything was obviously canceled. And of course, that continues to be, not a happy circumstance for anybody across the world, and especially, well, everybody, healthcare workers especially, but musicians are also really affected, and freelance musicians obviously the most. So none of this is good, but it did start to make me think with solo Bach, especially something that Christian Tetzlaff was talking about a few years back when he played all of them. And he said, there's something really weird about the grammar of the marking of the solo sonatas, because it's not say soli as it should be, but it's say solo. And so 6 solo, like you are alone. And that's what he kept going back to, this idea, like you are alone. So at the beginning of this pandemic, it really did feel like we were alone. Every person was alone. I was fortunate to be alone with my wife, Mimi.
Right.
And we're grateful to be able to play some music together and also to play music for one another. So I really feel like over the past few months, I've been working on these solo Bach pieces and playing them for her and really feeling like I'm studying with her. And it's so, I have the best circumstance that a musician could hope for in this kind of situation. And I've been trying to make the best of it with not just being alone, but also being alone with these pieces. Like the more I play them and the more I practice them and realize that I have a lot more work to do on them every day, the more I also realize that I'm not really alone, but at least I'm with the music. And so it's been really a source of comfort in this time to have the ability to practice these pieces and to have the gift of having these pieces handed down to us over generations. So I guess that's kind of that's what I decided at the outset. Like, let me try to now play all 6 of them instead of just focusing on these 2 that I was going to in March. Let's just keep it going and play all 6.
And you made the decision when you were working on them to work on them on your Baroque violin as opposed to your modern violin.
Yeah, so I guess that gets a little bit more into the idea of playing on instruments in different and varying states of historic undress. Okay, so I guess I'll just first go out there and say that I've chosen to play these pieces on the Baroque violin with a Baroque bow for a couple different reasons. I think the first reason, and I'm just going to go out there and say it, is that I think the Baroque violin and the Baroque bow are just better tools to render this music. And one of the reasons that I think that is that the Baroque violin and the Baroque bow are designed to create lots of variety in color. And it's all about not being uniform. So if you take the sound of the G string, D string, A string, and E string, and you just play one string after the next, you get 4 distinct timbres, 4 distinct colors, and it almost sounds like you could use it as a parallel for bass, tenor, alto, and soprano. And this music, it's this polyphonic music of Bach, especially in the fugues, it's all about having differentiation between the voices. So for that first reason alone, I think the lack of uniformity of the gut strings, the Baroque bow, and the Baroque setup really lend itself well to rendering Bach's solo violin works. I also, one of the other reasons that I've chosen to play these pieces on the Baroque violin is that I just like the way that it sounds and feels. I'm really drawn to this particular medium in a very visceral way. And I don't necessarily think that it's all that important to play Bach on the Baroque violin because there's some notion that it's historically accurate or historically literal or the way that it would have been done, quote unquote. I think that that's not really the point that's certainly not the reason that I'm interested in playing the Baroque violin. I mean, uh, I'm interested in this instrument from the perspective of creating something kind of new and novel. And it's also new in my own life, the journey that I've been on as a musician, somebody who grew up being trained on what we'd consider the traditional or modern violin, learning the Bach pieces on the modern violin. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, some of the best and some of my most favorite performances of these works have been played on a modern violin. I just think for me personally, at this point in my life, I believe in my own performing of them on the Baroque instrument. But this whole idea of historical accuracy is definitely not the reason that I'm interested in playing on the Baroque violin. And, you know, we're not listening with historical ears. I'm not interpreting with any kind of historical personality. I just have a very 21st century personality. And the influences that are all around us are the things that are going to bear on anybody's interpretation or anybody's performance of a work. Like I was noticing even last week, I heard an amazing recording on the radio of this violinist, and I didn't know at first who it was. I'm just listening on, and like the way this violinist is creating a sound that's not just one sound, but there's this weird blending of colors that's happening. I was so compelled by that. And at the end of the performance, they said, this is a performance by the jazz violinist Regina Carter. And I thought, okay, well, that was a fantastic example of somebody doing something that I want to do. And I actually find certain passages, like let's say in the Bach Preludio of the E major partita, that I can blend the sounds together in a way that's more reminiscent of what I heard Regina Carter doing with my Baroque violin and my Baroque bow. And that has nothing necessarily to do with being historically accurate, but it's somehow using these materials in a way that it's very compelling for me personally. So those are some of the reasons that I'm really interested in this medium.
Well, and it's interesting too that your Baroque violin is a modern instrument and your modern violin is a Baroque, or an instrument that was built, in that Baroque era. Have you thought about converting your Amati to a Baroque instrument ever, or no, you wouldn't do that?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about it. I mean, it's a funny thing, and sometimes it's hard when I'm talking to students at UC and introducing them to the concept of what is a Baroque violin and what's the difference between a modern violin and a Baroque violin. Because at first, so many students even who have studied classical music haven't come across this concept that there's actually a different instrument and that the instrument has evolved in its setup over the centuries. And so it can be a difficult thing at first to unpack. Well, okay, here's the violin, even though it was made in the year 2011, and here's the modern violin, even though it was made in the year 1734. And of course, it's been updated over the centuries. That
Right.
is why it's now called a modern violin, because when it was first made, it would have been what we now call a Baroque violin. It was just a violin at that time. Yeah, I've thought about it, but it's nice to have both instruments, and they're both very different. And I always wonder if I refitted the modern violin to become what it was maybe originally, what would happen to its personality? How would it change or not? And would I be happy about that? And I'm afraid to go in there and change hundreds of years of evolution. I guess it's kind of like a conservationist of an art piece. It's like, should I really do a big job on restoring this, or should I just be very conservative with the types of restoration work that happens? So
yeah, you might not be happy with the result, and then you're stuck because you can't go back, really.
You can't really, yeah.
No, I have found myself playing Baroque viola over the last 10 years, it actually informs my modern playing in many ways, playing the Baroque viola. And the gut strings and the bow, of course, have a lot to do with that. Do you find any particular challenges with gut strings that you could speak about as opposed to, you know, the metal strings that we use today?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things that's challenging is, well, things are less uniform. So
Which is a good thing, right?
I mean, one of the things that I think, you know, it's what the reason that I want to play these works on the Baroque violin and the fact that it's less uniform is also one of the challenges about it. It's much more susceptible to changes in humidity. And as a result of that, intonation can be a real challenge, and clarity can sometimes be a challenge. You get a note that squeaks and you can't do anything about it, and no matter how careful you are with your bow placement, your bow weight or your bow speed, you sometimes just get a squawk. And I've kind of decided that that's okay. I mean, that, you know, the more I worry about those types of things, the more those types of things happen. And that's also true. And I mean, that's also true when you have a very stable instrument like a modern violin that's more stable than a Baroque setup. Those things will happen anyway as well. Example, actually, when I started working on these and started recording them and then listening back, I could sometimes hear very, very early on as I'm listening back, like, oh, okay, I can really hear that all I care about in this recording is trying to play every note in tune. And it's super boring, you know, and like that, and that's not the point of using this instrument anyways, to try to play every note in tune and flawlessly, because it's just not going to be that. It doesn't lend itself to that. And from what we've read, at least, about hit accounts of people that played this instrument over the years, yes, there were always virtuosi, but standards of, let's say, every note being phonetically anesthetized to within an ounce of its life, no, there's not really that record. So that's also been a kind of challenge. It's like when you set up a video camera and you're in an empty space and you're playing something that's live and you're doing a full take and there's no stopping and starting, no editing. It's this weird in-between land where you're trying to give a very in-the-moment performance, but you also feel like you're in a recording session because there's nobody there.
Right.
And that kind of cognitive dissonance can set up for a real challenge in how to render a piece in a way that you believe that feels like a proper performance, and that's also not a total mess. so those have been some challenges.
Right, and intonation is different on a Baroque violin. Do you have any feeling about temperament, and do you play it differently as far as the intonation on your Baroque violin as opposed to your modern instrument?
Yeah, so absolutely. I do listen for specific notes on the instrument, and oftentimes I hear that when I listen back. So I'll listen for example, like the note G, or sometimes the note C in the temperament that I've been using for these pieces. It's not an equal temperament, and both of those pitches are just a little higher than what they would be in equal temperament. And sometimes when I listen back, I hear, oh yeah, there I am again, going back to my old equal temperament C. And part of it too is such a muscle memory thing, where if you're just used to placing your finger in a certain place on a violin, over years and years, you get used to just doing that. And so there are tiny things like that where when you do them back, then you start to think, okay, well, I can incorporate maybe a little bit more of the C that I really want to hear, rather than the C that I'm just habitually used to playing and that I play on a kind of muscle memory way. So all of it's been, I mean, and you know what, this is another thing that all violinists and string players with these solo works of Bach, whether they're the cello suites or the violin sonatas and partitas, and for violists, you get to play both.
Right.
It's something that you live with, you grow up, at least those of us who are classically trained probably grew up playing them, and we keep playing them, revisiting them, and will continue to do so as the years go by. So it really, and the more you do it, the more you realize how it's such a humbling process, because you think that you're going to sound like something that you have in your head, or that you can do this or this or this. And then you listen back and you think, man, I'm not fit for public consumption in any way.
Well, yes, we all feel that way.
I mean, that kind of humbling thing is good for all of us, but it's true. It's really true. So I'm grateful to the music for keeping me real, for sure.
And so you're going to play the E major partita for us, or we will be presenting a recording of you playing the E major partita. It will be recorded separately. And it's a very joyful work. I think of all the sonatas and partitas, it's probably the most upbeat in some ways. First of all, because of the key, but do you have any guidance for us as we listen, maybe specifically towards something that might be different in a Baroque performance as opposed to modern performance, or just in general?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm excited about, that I've kind of discovered over the past couple of months at revisiting this piece in particular, is the approach that I'm taking with the Preludio. When I learned it as a kid, especially, basically I learned it as what sounded almost like an etude. I mean, the Preludio, it's got a lot of perpetual motion and 16th notes that are just kind of spinning and spinning around from high to low and then low back to high. And Bach loved it. He even used it in one of his cantatas as well. He orchestrated it. But I've kind of decided to approach it maybe even more the way that I would approach, let's say, from the cello suites, the G major prelude, which is slightly more improvisatory, and also slightly more, as I was talking about earlier, maybe slightly more blended across the strings from one string to the other. There are two passages that are kind of famous, and violin teachers like to talk about them, because there's this stroke called bariolage, which just means string crossing. And it's going back and forth between three strings. And that was particularly the passage that I got excited about when I heard a recording of Regina Carter playing, and she was blending in a kind of weird double stoppy kind of way, which was neither a double stop nor a single note. And I thought, okay, that I can do that with the bariolage passages. And especially with the gut strings, there's a kind of weird color halo that can happen. And so I'm trying to approach the Preludio with a little bit more of that kind of freedom. And I'm really happy with the results that I've been getting with that. And the other movements, they're all dance movements. The Lure movement, which is the second movement, I learned it as a kid. It's as a very slow movement and a very lyrical movement. And the more that I've learned about Baroque dance forms, and the more lures that I've played, and even learning about the Lure bow stroke, it actually has quite a jauntiness to it, the Lure itself, and is often very much not a slow dance at all. So I'm trying to kind of traverse the tradition of the Lure being kind of lyrical and whimsical, with it also having a little bit more pep. So hopefully that comes through. Yeah, it is a joyous partita also because so many of the dances are witty, and some people have written. In fact, I think it was the violinist Gregory Fulkerson, who taught for a long time at Oberlin, who wrote that he actually thought that the E major partita was the most forward-looking of the six that Bach wrote because it's the most galant and has the most number of these French dances, these French influenced dance type movements.
Right, right.
So the gavotte has a lot of very fun couplets that are interspersed between the return of the rondo and then the minuets. I like to think of the two minuets as kind of inside and outside. So there's the first minuet that's a little bit more courtly almost, and then the second minuet, which is like it's portraying almost a musette where there's a drone instrument outside. And so those are also kind of fun. And then the last two movements I also think of as a pair, where there's a bourrée that's not all that refined as bourrées go. It's pretty stompy, and that leads into a gigue that it's an incredible thing that this little gigue dances the entire set of the six sonatas and partitas away, and it just kind of dances it out the door. So yeah, it's optimistic, and it's also kind of there's a lot of tongue in cheek in a way, and gallantry in this particular partita. So it's enjoyable to play and to listen to, I think.
Well, we are looking forward to hearing you play it, and we will listen to the E major partita. And thank you for your interview.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. I just want to say thanks again, and thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to share this music with everyone. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Thanks.